Let's be real here, folks. You are probably not playing as much interaction in your deck as you should be. Sure, you might have some counter spells to prevent any crazy big plays from occurring. You might even have some spot removal to take care of some of the bigger creatures popping up on the board. If things get a bit too out of hand, you might even have a couple board clears to reset everybody's creature count back to 0. But when Marty McMahon comes in or Peter Muldrotowicz struts up with their decks and they're just bringing everything back from the graveyard, you realize quite quickly that maybe you don't have enough. Now, there are a couple of colors that have a much easier time handling graveyard synergies than others. Green has Scavenging Ooze and Return to Nature. Black has Fairy Macabre and maybe Leyline of the Void. But some other colors might be not as much available to them to handle these sort of situations. That's why I come to you today with 5 graveyard-hating cards that can fit in any commander deck. And they all do something a little bit different, so I'm sure we can find one that will fit your deck's playstyle to handle your meta. Welcome to Chain of Commander. This is your Commander-in-Chief, Bill G, here today to help you prevent those graveyard strategies from getting a little too out of control in your next Commander pod. Now, let me preface today by saying that this list of 5 is not a top 5. They're not even in any particular order. I have just chosen them because they are 5 different ways to approach graveyard hate with minimal deck building costs. So, let's get started. We start today's list with an effect that used to require a green card to pull off. A couple years ago, Wizards decided to change the colored mana requirement and even make it a little bit cheaper for us, and they gave us our first card, Silent Gravestone. Silent Gravestone is a 1 mana artifact that says cards in graveyards cannot be the targets of spells or abilities. It also has an activated ability. For 4 generic and tapping it, you exile in Silent Gravestone and all graveyards draw a card. A card like this is very good at very specific strategies. It turns off things like Marin and Feldon that require you to target something in the graveyard, but allows things like Muldrotha to continue to cast their cards out of the graveyard. So, for a Muldrotha-like deck, they might want to consider something like this to protect their graveyard, so things can't be targeted by Return to Nature or Fairy Macabre, while also being able to turn off other things they may run into out there, such as the Marin or Feldon decks. It also has a couple more innocuous effects on the board. Things like Eternal Witness, Academy Ruins, Heliod's Hall of Generosity. All those sort of cards get turned off with something like this. Snapcaster can't bring anything back. It's very specific about not being able to target, and you'll be surprised how often that actually does come up in places you wouldn't expect it. So keep that in mind if you decide to play this card, because you actually might have more of an impact on the board than you originally thought you would. You know, sometimes though, just preventing them from targeting things in their graveyard might not be enough. They might have figured out a way around it, or their strategy might not require targeting. Then it does have the built-in activated ability to get rid of all the graveyards, and this can be done at instant speed, and it replaces itself. Now, 4 generic mana might be a bit steep for this effect, but it does have it just in case. And later on in Commander games, if you're not playing CEDH, 4 mana might not be too bad. It might be very possible to keep that aside while you still continue to progress your board state. The important thing is that it has it there. It's a versatile response to a variety of different strategies. Now, the next card we're going to talk about is, I see it as a little bit of a litmus test to how healthy Modern is. As you start to see this card come up in more and more sideboards of Modern, it starts showing that there might be a problem out there. And that card is Grafdigger's Cage. Grafdigger's Cage is a 1 mana artifact. It says, creature cards cannot enter the battlefield from graveyards or libraries, and spells cannot be cast from libraries. Now, very similar to Silent Gravestone, the static effect is the meat and potatoes of this card. Doesn't even have an activated ability to worry about. But this static ability is very impactful, as you find a lot of people, a lot of strategies rely on either casting something from the graveyard, returning a creature from the graveyard. Things like Marin attempts to bring them back. Muldrotha tries to cast them. Anything with flashback, the Savine deck relies on the flashback spells from being cast from the graveyard, and this disables all of that. And one more thing, it also prevents creatures from entering from libraries. Things like Green Sun Zenith, Genesis Wave, Collected Company no longer can get those creatures on the field. You can no longer fetch for a Dryad Harbor with your fetch land because it's a creature and it can't enter from that library. So once again, this card will have an effect on the table that you might not have initially thought of. And green players who aren't normally paying attention to graveyard hate now have something to be concerned about, that you are now preventing their strategy from progressing forward. One thing I forgot to mention about it, it also prevents spells from being cast from libraries. A weird thing, but things like Elsha that lets you look at the top card of your library and cast it. Bolas' Citadel combo, which does the same thing. They get turned off by that. So once again, this card, affecting more than your initial hate. It's affecting more than graveyards and does affect more strategies out there than you'd think it would initially. And that's a good thing to keep in mind. The next card on our list is the newest card to the list. When I first saw this card, I'll be honest with you, it flew right under my radar. I just looked at it as another cheap, uncommon, graveyard hating card because Wizards has been printing about one of those every block or so just to keep the interaction there. But the more I look at this one, the more impressed I've been. And that card is Soul Guide Lantern. Soul Guide Lantern is another 1 mana artifact. Hope you're noticing a trend there. With when this card enters the battlefield, exile target card from a library, and it has 2 activated abilities. The first one is tap and sack it to exile all graveyards your opponents control. And the second one is pay 1, generic, tap, sack, and draw a card. Now the thing that I think is pushing this far and ahead of other artifact-based graveyard hate is the asymmetry about it. While a lot of these effects affect everybody, this one only affects your opponents. This comes in very handy for wheel-style decks, such as Nekuzar, where you also want to maintain any sort of mill plan. What you can do is you can activate the Time Twister effects, such as Memory, the memory half of Commit to Memory, and with that on the stack, activate this so that the opponents can only shuffle their hands into their decks. They don't get the benefit of putting all their graveyard cards back in the deck. This also works very nicely in Muldrotha decks. They can now exile their opponent's graveyards, keep theirs intact. They can even cycle it for 2 mana. They can go through the cycle of just drawing cards off of it as an artifact. In Muldrotha mirror matches, the deck that gets this out first becomes the threat of the table and becomes very difficult for the other decks to handle it. Just far and away, as this card has been out there, I've become more and more impressed with what it does, and the fact that it's asymmetrical opens up so many more avenues for being able to handle your opponents with very minimal interference to what you're doing, and that means it can go in so many more decks. The next card we're going to talk about here is the card that caused me to overlook Soul Guide Lantern, as I just thought that Soul Guide Lantern was a worse version of this one. That card is Relic of Progenitus. Believe it or not, it's another 1 mana artifact with 2 activated abilities. The first one is to tap it, target opponent exiles a card from their graveyard, or the next one is pay 1 generic mana, exile Relic, all players exile their graveyards, and you draw a card. As you can see, the 2 activated abilities are kind of similar to Soul Guided Lantern, but a little bit different as well. Relic takes the draw card and the exiling of graveyards and smushes them into 1 ability, but then gives us the second ability to tap and target an opponent exiles a card from their graveyard. This may seem a bit underwhelming, but as games go on, the incremental value you can get from this is pretty good. Every turn cycle, if you don't have a way to untap it, you can focus on the player that you know will be utilizing their graveyard the most, and one at a time have them exile a card from their graveyard. Now, it is their choice, so they can choose whatever affects them the least, but when they are looking for that critical mass of cards in the graveyard to work with, slowly making them take them out one at a time over the course of the game can definitely set them back and slow them down enough that you can then handle it or surpass their advantage with your own advantage. Now, it does have that second effect to nuke all graveyards, and you can do both in one turn, so that you could go about tapping it, having somebody exile a card from their graveyard, and if that ends up not being enough, you can then still pay only the one to exile it in all graveyards and to draw a card. Once again, like Silent Gravestone, this ability gives us the way to replace the card itself. So, at worst, 2 mana to draw another card, which is your standard cost of cycling a card. Once again, very low cost to play this card in the deck, but has the ability to produce incremental gains like none other card on our list can do. And that is something to keep in mind if you are going for a more low to the ground, grindier approach to managing the table. For the last card on our list, I know I said at the beginning of this video that this list was in no particular order, but I would be lying to you if I said that this last card wasn't my favorite. It takes advantage of a subtype that prior to the set it was released in wasn't really used at all, and it's a little bit different than the rest of the cards on our list in a very noticeable way. The last card on our list is Scavenger Grounds. Scavenger Grounds is a land desert with tap, add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool, or has an activated ability, pay 2 generic mana, tap, and sacrifice a desert, exile all cards from all graveyards. Now, prior to the Amonkhet block, there were only, I believe, 1 or 2 deserts out there, and there were very few things where deserts matter. I don't think there was anything where deserts matter, really, and they really ramped it up, that mechanic, in the Amonkhet block, introducing a series of utility lands that involved sacrificing deserts to have some effect. This one, I believe, will far and away be the most powerful out of all of them because it introduced an effect in a land that has virtually no deck building restriction. It comes in untapped, it taps for colorless mana, as utility lands tend to do, and it can sacrifice itself or other deserts to exile graveyards. I want you to compare this to other utility lands out there. Scavenger Grounds, as of right now, is in approximately 4% of decks according to EDH Rec. Cards like Ghost Quarter and Strip Mine, they're individually in each about 1 in about every 10, just under 10% for each of them. And then you have cards like Reliquary Tower that are in 35% of decks. 4% for Scavenger Ground, 35% for Reliquary Tower. That tells me there's about 8 times as many people who think that they're more likely to have 7 or more than 7 playable cards in their hand than they are to run into a graveyard strategy at the board. And that is absurd to me, because you are significantly more likely to run into a graveyard deck than you are to, at any given moment, have more than 7 playable cards that you really need to keep in your hand. Now, that's not to say that cards like Ghost Quarter, Reliquary Tower, Strip Mine, that they don't have their place. They definitely do. But when there's such a discrepancy between the amount of people playing a Reliquary Tower and the amount of people playing a Scavenger Grounds, it's a sign that there might be a priority discrepancy between what people think they want and what people actually need. Now, granted, in multicolored decks, 3-color decks and up, having too many utility lands is a problem, and this one might be one to make the cut, especially because once you're playing more colors, you have access to more colored graveyard answers. But if you're playing a single color, if you're playing 2 colors, there's almost no reason why you don't fit in a desert package into your land base, because they are effects, they are essentially spells that have no deck building cost at that point. Now, y'all out there are playing your Bajuka Bogs. This is like that for everybody, except it has the benefit of coming in untapped, being used for mana off the get-go, and being able to be activated at instant speed. It's a Bajuka Bog for everyone, and I think everyone should consider playing this if their decks are 1 or 2 colors. So that's my list for today. It's based off of my observations, my opinions, my research. What do you guys play for your graveyard? Hey, do you play any of these cards? Do you play something else? Do you have knowledge of older cards that I might not be familiar with? I don't know every Magic card. I try to do my research, but there's always something that goes under the radar. Definitely let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, hey, hit the subscribe button. I'm a new channel. I'm just looking to work with you guys and get to know you guys and work together to improve our Commander playing abilities. You know, while you're down there, there's that little bell icon. I don't know what it does. Does anybody even use the bell icon? Try hitting the bell icon. See what happens. I'm Bill G. I'm thanking you for having me today. I'll see you next week.